Welcome to today's Ask a Specialist webinar. This webinar is made possible by Las Cumbres Community Services. Our organization began its services in Los Alamos County over 50 years ago now, and we currently provide a wide range of services for families in Santa Fe, Rio Arriba, Taos, and Los Alamos counties. You can check out our website and the services that we offer in each community. All services that we provide are free of charge for families, and thanks to a grant from Los Alamos County, we've expanded our services in Los Alamos and recently opened a physical location here in town. My name is Teal Radford. I'm a speech therapist. I've worked at Las Cumbres for as long as I've been practicing speech therapy, which is 6 years. I have passion for this age group specifically. I think it's such a beautiful unfolding to see babies and toddlers beginning to say their first words and beginning to realize the power behind communication and make the social connections that communication allows us to make. In today's webinar, we're going to be talking about intelligibility. This might be a new word for you, and so I'm going to define it as we go along. But basically, this topic is looking at what makes it easier or in most cases harder to understand the speech of your child, especially when we have a new talker on our hands. They can be really hard to understand for a variety of reasons. And we're going to take a look at what those reasons most often are and how we can help support clearer communication for a child from ages birth to 3. If you have any questions, visit the Ask a Specialist page on the Las Cumbres website. There's a form that you can fill out to ask your question and get some information and answers. Thank you for attending. Okay, let's get started. I want to acknowledge that this word intelligibility sounds a lot like intelligence. Intelligibility and intelligence have nothing to do with each other. They are not related in any way. A child with low intelligibility does not have low intelligence. The definition of intelligibility simply means capable of being understood, and this is Merriam-Webster's definition. Intelligibility is influenced by a lot of different factors, and that is what we're going to start by going through. I'll give you some examples of how all these different factors feed into a child's overall intelligibility. One thing that often influences intelligibility is context of the conversation. So even if you're not able to understand what your child is saying, if they're able to point to the granola bar in the pantry, then that context clue can help fill in the blanks and increase intelligibility. So being able to gesture or being able to observe the child within the context of what they're trying to communicate about is often really helpful. And this is most often frustrating for parents when there is no context for what their child is trying to say. Maybe they're trying to talk about something that already happened in the past or something that's in another room. And in this case, we have no context and it makes it harder to understand what your child is saying to you. First, I want to offer some statistics on what a normal percentage of intelligibility should be for this age. As I mentioned, a beginning talker, we don't really expect them to be really great at pronunciation. We expect a 2-year-old to be understood or intelligible about 50% of the time. A 3-year-old should be intelligible about 75% of the time. And it's not until kids are closer to 4 that we would have an expectation of being able to understand everything that they're saying. So this is all just to point out that it is expected and normal and okay if you can't understand everything your toddler is trying to say. There are 5 different bullet points up on the screen under perceptual speech symptoms. These are all bullet points of aspects influencing intelligibility. So these aspects could be speech sound disorders, such as articulation or phonological processes. Perceptual voice feeds into overall intelligibility. Is your volume, pitch, quality, and resonance appropriate to help you convey your message and be understood? Rate can influence how your speech is perceived and make it harder or easier to understand speech. The fluency of speech. And finally, prosody, or the melody of the sentence or the phrase that you're saying. Prosody actually helps increase intelligibility by inserting pauses, highlighting certain words, going faster over words that don't matter as much, and slowing down on more important parts of an utterance or a sentence. So all 5 of these aspects do influence intelligibility, and we're going to break it down and look at each of these bullet points separately. First, we're going to take a look at speech sound disorders. Articulation is something that I hear a lot from parents. We're worried about his articulation. He's talking now, but his articulation is bad. We can't understand him. So I put together this little triangle representing a hierarchy of communication skills. When I'm working with any young client, social skills are the most important prerequisite for all future communication skills. And these social skills are very important to have in place before we start thinking about repeating words, and definitely before we start thinking about articulation. The next step up this triangle is receptive skills, or how your child is understanding. We do need a really solid foundation of receptive skills before we would expect a child to start using those words in their own speech. So we want them to understand what book means before we'd expect them to start saying book. The third part of the triangle going upwards says expressive skills. Expressive skills mean that your child is comfortable asking for what they want, using words to share something interesting that they have observed in the environment, or ask for a book, or tell you that they're thinking about their grandma. And this has to do with the language aspect in the brain more than the speech aspect. So you want to see that they have a good vocabulary, that they're trying to put those vocab words together into short phrases and even sentences. And only when all 3 bottom foundational parts of this triangle are in place, as in like 100% in place, would we start to think about articulation. The language aspect of what is your child trying to say, and do they have an understanding of what words to use, especially at the birth to 3 age, is just so much more important than how it's coming out. So being an early intervention speech therapist, I actually avoid working on articulation. In 99% of cases, it's not appropriate to be working on articulation with a child that's 2 or 3. So if your child has a problem with speech sounds, like the speech distortions or substitutions that we observe in an articulation or phonological disorder, it might not be in our best interest to focus on articulation before the age of 3. If the phonological process or the articulation error is really unusual, atypical, or unexpected, even at a young age, I might work on it with a 2-year-old. But like I said, I really want to hammer home the idea that articulation practice really should not be where your head's at in 99% of cases before 3 years old. Sometimes I'll target it in therapy using really indirect methods like auditory bombardment, where they just hear the word a lot, or trying to get them to look at my mouth while I'm producing that sound over and over in a lot of different contexts. And those are indirect methods because they're not actually asking the child to repeat again and again and again something that they're pronouncing wrong. Physical cues like prompt cueing can help kids create muscle memory for certain mouth positions. So occasionally I will use prompt hands-on prompting to help a child form a mouth shape that they're not able to do on their own or with verbal cues. But please keep in mind throughout this presentation that there are a lot of sounds that a 3-year-old isn't expected to say correctly, and that is more than okay. So I say only work on intelligibility at this age if and when social and language skills are 100% age appropriate. I would even say like 110% age appropriate. We are not super worried about articulation for a 2-year-old. Content, the language part of communication, is more important for a 2 to 3-year-old than sound production or articulation. I have seen some unfortunate outcomes of working on articulation too early. The dangers of overcorrecting include avoidance of therapy tasks in general and avoidance of speaking tasks, especially with a person that your child might know is going to correct them. So I really try to avoid creating this negative association at this young age. It's not usually appropriate to work on articulation with a 2-year-old. This next slide shows what are called the early 8 speech sounds. P, B, M, N, D, W, Y, and H are 8 of the early 8 speech sounds. These are sounds that we'd expect a child to master in the beginning of words by the time they turn 3 years old. So thinking about how many letters are in our alphabet, we're looking at only 8 sounds that we want them to be able to master only in the beginning position of words, as in the first letter of a word, by the time they turn 3. I put up this word list that gives you some ideas of toddler-friendly words you can use to practice these early 8 speech sounds with your young one, or you can use these word lists to kind of assess how the sound is coming out. So you can use this list to quote unquote evaluate, a little informal check-in for what speech sounds your child is making. A lot of times we can just listen to our children as they talk, observe the sounds that you are hearing correctly in the beginning of words, or try to think back to words that you've heard your child say and think about how the sound sounds at the front of their words. You can also show your child pictures of things like, for example, ball, if you're wondering how their B sound is coming out. Show them pictures of these words and ask them, what's this? And this will prompt your child to say the word without hearing your own spoken example first. If you tell your child, say ball, you're actually giving them a few more clues to how to produce that sound correctly that they wouldn't get if they're just looking at a picture and having to come up with that word and sound out of thin air or out of their own brain. So if you can, it's best to get your child to say a word without hearing your example first when you're taking a look at these speech sounds. If you notice that your child is making certain sounds in some words and not other words, this is really common among the clients that I see in early intervention. And this is what we call stimulability. They are making it sometimes, or they're making the sound correctly after they hear an example first, or after we give them a touch cue, kind of giving them a clue how to produce this sound. So if they're able to do it in some situations and not all situations, this is often a good sign that the sound is coming. It's on the way. Certain sound combinations are more difficult than others. So consider this a good sign if you hear the sound at all, even if it's just in 1 or 2 words. Words that are easiest to say are 1-syllable words. The yellow box has another new vocab word for you guys, Visines. These are speech sounds that are visible. So the perfect example is If you're looking at my little Zoom square, when I say you can see exactly what you need to do to imitate that sound. So there's a strong visual cue. Is a viseme, and an example of a sound that's really not visible might be g. You're seeing part of what I'm doing to create that sound, but the real action is taking place in the back of my throat. So visemes are really great early targets because they include a visual cue, which is helpful for a lot of kids. Remember that we're only looking at the beginning sound of a word. We're not looking at the middle or end sound production. And the blue box, the last one, says, keep it fun and playful. Please, I'm going to keep bringing it up throughout this presentation. We never should be drilling articulation for a toddler. It's just not appropriate. If your kid isn't having fun practicing these words with you, you're doing it wrong. Find a fun way to introduce these ideas, and we have to keep it really fun. We don't want them to start avoiding speech tasks, and overcorrecting speech sound production is not our goal here. Another type of speech sound error is a phonological process. Phonological processes are developmentally appropriate patterns of sound errors. The key word in this definition is pattern of sound error. So we're not looking at just one speech sound that they are not able to produce, or looking kind of at groupings of speech sounds, maybe based on the placement or the voicing of the sounds. So this first slide includes examples of phonological processes that should disappear by the time your child turns 3. The first process they mention is unstressed syllable deletion. This means deleting a weak syllable in a multi-syllable word like banana. Almost every kid learning to say banana says nana at first. They're just chopping off the least important part of the word or the quieter part of the word, which is the. Final consonant deletion. I get a lot of questions about this one. So kids that are leaving end sounds off of words like cat instead of cat. This is considered developmentally appropriate until your child turns 3. So don't stress too much about if you see this process, this pattern of errors. The third one that they mention on this chart is diminutization, adding an E at the end of nouns, doggy instead of dog. I actually attribute this to how we present these words to kids, but don't worry if you notice your child doing this. This is considered developmentally appropriate until the age of 3. Velar fronting means that your child is substituting a sound in the front of their mouth instead of saying a sound in the back of their mouth. So the example they give here is tan instead of can. They're moving this throat sound to the front of the mouth. So a child that says tan instead of can would also say tootie instead of cookie. Again, this is really common, and it's okay if you see your 2-year-old displaying this phonological process. Consonant assimilation is the next one. This involves changing a phoneme so that it takes on the same characteristic as another sound in the word. So this is, where they want to repeat the same sound at the beginning and end of word rather than change the placement from back of the throat to front of the mouth. So instead of saying cat, they're keeping it all right here to make it a little bit easier for them to form all these movements, and they're just simply doing tat. And when you think about it from that placement perspective, it is really easy to see why this is a pattern for a lot of kids. They're literally making it easier for themselves. They don't have to move their articulators as far when they're assimilating sounds. Reduplication is super common for new talkers. This classic example, baba instead of bottle. This is really similar to the one that we just talked about. It's easier to repeat one syllable than to put one syllable and then a different syllable right after. Bottle involves a lot more motor control and thought process than just being able to repeat that movement for baba. So again, this process is normal until your child turns 3. Finally, prevocalic voicing. Voiced consonants are easier for kids to produce than unvoiced consonants. I think because the voiced consonant is just louder, it's easier to perceive and it's easier to produce than a quieter unvoiced consonant. So for example, your child might be observed saying zun instead of sun, or gat instead of cat. Okay, so here are some examples of phonological processes that are appropriate and expected to persist even after 3 years old. So these are things that even your 3-year-old might be doing. Cluster reduction means that clean sounds like keen. They're taking out that combination of consonant sounds, normal. Adding epithesis is adding a vowel sound into the middle of a word, black instead of black. Again, this is kind of demonstrative of kids learning to sequence different sounds together and squish those sounds really close together and move their tongue really quickly to produce these more complicated words. So this is considered normal even after 3 years old. Gliding is super common. So this is one instead of run, or wabbit instead of rabbit. So vocalization, vowelization involves substituting a vowel in the place of where a consonant should be. So ke instead of car, they are having trouble producing that R and they're substituting a vowel sound instead. Vowel sounds are a lot easier to produce. Stopping is really common when kids are learning how to create fricative sounds, or these long sounds like z, zh. And commonly kids learn to put a stop sound or a quicker sound in there. So they might say done instead of sun. If you say those two words to yourself right now, you will observe that your tongue is more or less in the same place for the s and the d. It's just that s requires a longer placement and it's a little bit more complicated of a movement. So they're simplifying in a way that makes speech easier. Depalatalization, substituting a non-palatal consonant for a palatal consonant. Shy might sound like sigh. Again, this is simplifying the movement needed to say the word. And finally, final consonant devoicing, substituting a final voiceless consonant for the voiced consonant. So the example they give is that your child might say back instead of bag. They're kind of still playing around with voicing. G and K are produced in exactly the same spot. The only difference is whether or not we're pushing air through our vocal folds when we create the sound for g and not for k. These are all phonological processes that persist even after 3 years old. So as you can see, there are a lot of speech sound errors that are considered normal. I said I was going to keep bringing it up, and this is my final plea. Never make speech sounds your exclusive focus with a baby or a toddler. It's never appropriate to drill your toddler or ask them to repeat the same word again and again and again outside of something that they consider playful or fun or outside of a meaningful context. Having fun, being silly are some of my gateways into being able to practice these words without driving kids, toddlers crazy. Remember, if you're not having fun, they're definitely not having fun. So keep it fun. If you have concerns about specific speech sounds or phonological processes, what I would recommend for the birth to 3 population is indirect therapy methods. These are methods that don't require your child to try to imitate. They don't involve correction. They're simply indirect examples that give your child some more clues about how to create those sounds more clearly. The first one I put is auditory bombardment. This is kind of a funny name for a strategy that just involves focusing on one sound and repeating it within the context of a lot of different words. If you can find a book that focuses on the word be on every page, that would be a great book to use an auditory bombardment for the B sound. When you're doing auditory bombardment, it's also helpful to overemphasize the movement of your lips, big B. So you're really giving them a clear visual of what your mouth is doing when you're making that sound. But auditory bombardment really just means that the adult in the situation is focusing on producing that sound clearly and over, so kind of highlighting that sound. Indirect methods might also include strong visual cues and supports. I kind of rolled that into my explanation of auditory bombardment, but strong visual cues are really helpful. Ba, 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 ba. Finally, one of the best ways to work on sound production for a child between, under 3 years old would be slowing your speech down. This gives them more time to process the visual cues that you are giving them, and it also helps conceptually separate the sounds in words. Slowing down our speech can be really hard for those of us that live busy lives and like to talk fast. So in many cases, I see that simply slowing speech down really helps give kids the support they need to try these sounds with more success. Going back to our original chart of perceptual speech symptoms, let's take a look at voice. Voice isn't necessarily a symptom that I often see in the birth to 3 population interfering with intelligibility. If a child has an unusually quiet volume, that will definitely affect intelligibility. A child who is shy or doesn't feel as confident using their voice in new situations, especially, could definitely be influencing their intelligibility if volume is too low. Voice quality is the other one that I have seen in my practice in early intervention. If a child has severe allergies, either to something they're eating or even seasonal allergies, if you notice a really noticeable hoarseness or raspy voice quality, that aspect of their voice could be influencing how easily they're understood. When we're looking at rate of speech, we were just talking about the importance of slowing down our own speech production to give kids an easier time understanding and copying what our speech sounds like. Jargon is something that all kids do. It's kind of a bridge in between babbling and speaking in sentences. Jargon sounds like connected speech, like a phrase or a sentence, but in a foreign language. So it's strings of a lot of different sounds, a lot of up and down change in pitch. They're seeming to highlight certain words. So they really have like a melody to the speech, but it doesn't include real words. After 30 months of age or 2.5 years, if your child is exclusively using jargon or nonsense words, this can be a red flag. We definitely expect it to fade away as they start replacing jargon with words that we can understand. But jargon is probably the biggest way that I see rate influencing intelligibility. So I have an example of some jargon that I'm going to share with you guys now.
Yeah?
So for a child who's using excessive jargon, I might just recommend parents to slow down their own rate. But again, at her age, it looks like she might be in that age range where her jargon is considered developmentally appropriate. If you notice your child using excessive jargon, I recommend to focus on building their vocabulary, focus on the meaning of words, so supporting their receptive language or their understanding of what different words mean. And if you can understand any words or pick any words out of that jargon that you feel like you understand, to repeat those parts of their sentence back to them. Fluency pattern is really talking about stuttering. And stuttering is a question that I get occasionally as a speech therapist in early intervention. I have a little video I want to share with you guys, and then we'll talk a little bit more about stuttering.
Yeah, but we're going to have a dog.
All children learning to speak experience some stuttering, repetition, and disfluency when they're tired, when they're not feeling well, when they're rushed, when they're trying to express something really complicated. Between the ages of 2 and 3, if you notice your child starting to stutter, it's not necessarily something that we want to pay a lot of attention to. I recommend parents to ignore that stutter for 6 months. A lot of times at this age, even into the preschool age, a stutter will go away on its own within 6 months. I see it as a sign that your child is trying to say a really complicated thought, and they might not have the motor abilities to sequence that many sounds together really quickly. And some kids will use these disfluencies, repeating something so that they can hold the floor until they're able to get out the rest of their sentence. So definitely at this age, if you do notice your child stuttering, I would say to ignore it, to not bring attention to it, model slow, calm speech, and give them your full attention when they're talking to you without drawing attention to their stuttering. Obviously, fluency pattern is on this list of perceptual speech symptoms because it can really interrupt intelligibility and influence how easily we can be understood. The final bullet point on this slide is prosody. Prosody really doesn't come into play for intelligibility for kids from 0 to 3. We wouldn't necessarily expect them to be able to use a lot of pitch changes, emphasizing certain words and de-emphasizing other words. They're really working on just putting those words in, period. It can be helpful to use prosody as a teaching tool. A lot of times putting words in the context of a sing-song voice can really help kids remember how to sequence certain words and can actually help them move from 1-word to 2-word phrases or 2-word phrases to 3-word phrases, because they're hanging the words on the pitch changes, on the melody of the song. So it can be a really helpful way to teach kids how to string more and more words together into longer phrases if you model those words using really exaggerated prosody. Prosody can also be used to help kids practice multi-syllable words like butterfly. If you can help kids give melody to words, they may be able to reproduce that word with all its components more easily. So in closing, I want to bring you back to these statistics we talked about at the beginning. A 2-year-old, we'd only expect them to be able to be understood half the time. A 3-year-old, 75% of the time, and we should only understand everything they say by the time they're 4. So this is my final plea not to make articulation or practicing individual speech sounds the center of your instruction with your child. Modeling calm, clear, slow speech and other indirect methods that we talked about today are your best bet for working on intelligibility and helping your child be better understood. If you have any questions about today's topic, visit our Ask a Specialist webpage at www.lascumbres-nm.org/ask-a-specialist, or you can go to lascumbres-nm.org and put Ask a Specialist in the search bar. It will bring you to our Ask a Specialist page. And on that page, there is a box where you can send us your questions, so please do. We also would like to invite you to fill out our survey. Let us know what you think of today's workshop. Let us know what topics you'd like to see covered in future workshops. Let us know how we did. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Please share this video with whoever you think might benefit from knowing this information. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.